Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast with my co-host today, Erika Weed. Hello, Erika. Good morning. All right. So we're going to have a little conversation here today, and I'm going to open up a little bit with this thought. This is kind of a continuation from the last episode. If you listened to our last episode about 100 years of solitude, and thus we get to the Dark Triad of leadership traits: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. These three traits, these three elements combine in the form of a leader, Colonel Arcadio Buendia, moving from being a person of intellect in 100 Years of Solitude to being a person of action, but in a way that's hidden even from himself. Which is interesting because of the first line that opens up 100 Years of Solitude, and I quote, "Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Arcadio Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice." Now, I came to 100 Years of Solitude completely by accident from Joan Didion's great self-aware memoir, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which we'll cover in a future episode of the podcast. Great book. We're going to pair that up with Movable Feast. We're going to talk about self-awareness in the memoir. I fundamentally believe that leaders must be self-aware in order to avoid the Dark Triad that Colonel Buendia exhibited throughout the remaining 2/3 of 100 Years of Solitude, and to avoid taking their people into wars, disputes, conflicts, and disagreements that fundamentally are only going to lead to more endless wars, civil problems, disputes, and strifes. But then I ran across Erika, and then I ran across a guy named Niccolo. And so I want to pull today, and I want to talk with Erika about the seminal, I think, first probably, but seminal book on the Dark Triad of leadership, The Prince. Now, the translation that I have is a little bit different. There's multiple translations floating around, and we'll talk about that. Different translations give you different tastes, different flavors of what Machiavelli was speaking of and what he was talking about. And I'm not going to go into Machiavelli's background. You can get all that from other places. You don't need me for that. Go search the internet. However, Niccolo had a different viewpoint on all of this, and he was probably the first person to lay this out succinctly in the history of the world, that Renaissance fellow that he was. And so he opens in his dedication of The Prince with this line: "I have not found among my possessions anything which I hold more dear than, or value so much as, the knowledge of the actions of great men, acquired by long experience in contemporary affairs, and a continual study of antiquity, which, having reflected upon it with great and prolonged diligence, I now send, digested into a little volume, to your magnificence. And although I may consider this work unworthy of your countenance, nevertheless I trust much to your benignity, that it might be acceptable, seeing that it is not possible for me to make a better gift than to offer you the opportunity of understanding in the shortest time all that I have learnt in so many years. And with so many troubles and dangers, which work I have not embellished with swelling or magnificent words, nor stuffed with rounded periods, nor with any extrinsic allurements or adornments, whatever, with which so many are accustomed to embellish their works. For I have wished that either that no honor should be given it, or else that the truth of the matter and the weightiness of the theme shall make it acceptable. Nor do I hold with those who regard it as a presumption if a man of low and humble condition dare to discuss and settle the concerns of princes, which we're going to do on the podcast today. Because just as those who draw landscapes place themselves below in the plain to contemplate the nature of the mountains and of lofty places, and in order to contemplate the plains place themselves upon high mountains, even so to understand the nature of the people, it needs to be a prince. And to understand that of princes, it needs to be of the people. And that's just the opening. Anger, arrogance, pride, overweening ambition, a desire for authority, and a desire to rule over others. The reality of leadership is that what's done in the dark is very often rewarded in light. And in the space of telling the raw perceived truth of leadership, the man, such as it were, at the top of the mountain, such as it were, is the Renaissance writer Niccolo Machiavelli. You can read about Machiavelli's birth everywhere. Like I said, I'm not going to talk to you about any of that today. Instead, we're going to talk about the things that no one wants to talk about in leadership today. We're going to talk about being selfish rather than being collaborative. We're going to talk about the selfish desires of leaders rather than the expansive desires of teams very often. We're going to talk about a leader as a no-holds-barred jungle fighter. By the way, there's a guy named Jeffrey Pfeffer who wrote that in a book, Leadership BS, Fixing Careers and Workplaces One Truth at a Time. And we're going to peel away some chunks from the myth of leadership, or maybe some layers from the onion. Because what leaders do in the dark that they deem effective and appropriate to accomplishing their own goals matters quite a bit for us to understand. And Machiavelli, often seen as the main advocate of getting dirty, may actually be misunderstood by us, I think. I don't think he was maybe easy to buttonhole or easy to pigeonhole as he's been made to appear. So in order to understand this and put it in its proper context, I would like to welcome the soon-to-be current doctoral candidate, Erika Weed. Erika is a professional executive coach, development consultant. She founded her consulting firm, Ascendry Incorporated, in 2015. So she's an entrepreneur, which is great. She's a doctoral candidate at George Washington University, pursuing a degree in human and organizational development, focused on leader behavior and development. Her LinkedIn profile, which you should go connect with her on LinkedIn, and I'll have all of the links to her profiles, her social stuff, her research, anything else in the show notes below this episode. So her LinkedIn profile quite succinctly states that, quote, "As a coach, I support my clients in their work to learn about themselves. As a facilitator, I support groups as they learn about how to function together. And as a student, I'm working to better understand the truth about leadership, effectiveness, and achieving goals. My goal is to create a more inclusive model of leadership in order to better understand the most effective leadership characteristics in the context of real organizations." And as you know, if you know anything about me and you've been listening to the podcast, yeah, we're reading literature, and yeah, we're reading great books, but we're also in the pursuit of truth, no matter where that journey may lead. As I said before, welcome, Erika.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be able to talk about The Prince. I haven't picked it up in several years, so it's nice to be back with the literature.
Now, is there anything that I said in my opening that is patently incorrect that we need to start off with in pursuit of the truth?
Yeah. So as I mentioned to you, I am an academic at heart, and there are a couple of things that are just challenging to me, and definitions are something that I am passionate about making sure that we're all clear on. So when we talk about leadership, a lot of people mischaracterize leadership as a position. So we get very comfortable talking about the leader as a person, or leadership as a position up at the top making decisions. And I think the better way to understand leadership is that it's a relationship. It's a relationship between you, the leader, and those who follow. There was a great quote in some of my dark leader literature that talks about, you can't have leadership without followers. Otherwise, you're a crazy person talking to yourself.
You're just walking around for no reason.
Exactly. And so, we have to fundamentally think of leadership in the context of the other people around it. So it is leadership with followers. So that means that we really need to focus on the relationship, and you can have good relationships or you can have bad relationships, but we're going to talk about leadership as a relationship. And the other thing to remember is that when we talk about the Dark Triad, we're not talking about personality traits. So personality traits are characteristics that you are born with. They're ingrained in your DNA. There are some that are activated early on in life between 4 and 7. But basically, by the time you're a teenager, your personality is fixed. And so we don't talk about the Dark Triad as personality traits. They are more a collection of personalities that are then informed by the traits. So we have, in the Dark Triad, we have narcissism, Machiavellianism, and corporate psychopathy. If you look at the literature around something called the Dark Tetrad, then we add in something very fun called everyday sadism. And so these aren't characteristics, these aren't traits, these are just personalities that are informed just like your personality or my personality.
So a couple of different things there that allow me to key off into various things. We're going to jump around here a little bit today, because as Erika speaks, I'm going to be thinking, and by the way, all of you who are listening should be thinking, and you should be taking notes, by the way, on this episode. So those who listen to podcasts and take notes become better leaders. So I'll just say that right off the bat. So as we think about this idea of leadership as a relationship, which again, I don't disagree with you about that. Actually, that's fundamental to what we do as a leadership consultancy. We do view the leader-follower dynamic as a space where there is an emotional exchange. Usually it is emotional contagion. Most people can't. Well, I won't say most people. Most leaders and followers fail to understand how deeply that relationship goes. There's also a lot of other things that go into how deep that leadership, relationship can get. When we separate that fundamentally from the idea of leadership as position. So positional leaders merely have authority, and authority is not necessarily competency, which is a whole other different kind of issue, which we can talk about that too. But authority is not necessarily competency. Authority is not necessarily mastery. Matter of fact, if you go look at the work of Robert Cialdini, the guy who wrote the great book Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion, he lists authority as one of those persuasive elements that allows individuals to kind of do what it is that they do. And we fundamentally reject leadership theories, in essence, charisma or, servant leadership or any of that. And we say that there are, and this is what I'm currently writing my book about, there are actual skill sets that you can actually gain as a leader or as a person who's pursuing if we want to frame it this way, which people do. So, okay, leadership position. If you want to do that, if you want to get in that relationship, there are certain things, 12 of them we actually think, that you should be able to do pretty much effectively. Now, can everybody do all 12 at the highest level all of the time? No, but you should at least have some conception that these things all click in together. And then where our conversation today really fits in there is in this idea of what is a leader's role, what is a leader's responsibility to that relationship, and then how do we effectively kind of make that, I hesitate to use the term make that work, but make that work, right? How do we make that be effective so that there is an outcome? Because organizations, quite frankly, care about outcomes.
Sure, that's the whole reason they exist.
Right, exactly. They care about production, something getting out the door. And increasingly in our knowledge economy, the thing that gets out the door is not, and you and I have kind of talked about this offline, but the thing that gets out the door is not necessarily physical product. It's intellectual product or emotional product, and it's not. And now we're in, I think, the weird third turning of leadership, where it was in the 20th century primarily driven by how does GE, which is breaking up, how does IBM get a physical product out the door? And now it's to How do we emotionally connect with people because of this thing called the internet, because of a bunch of other stuff that's happened at a sociocultural level that, again, people really don't understand.
And, third turning, more like the 300th turning. We are in the middle of a cycle that has, been going on for millennia. The idea that, something happens and in order to survive, we need to change. And how do we change? Well, we look to, someone with a vision that we like, and then we decide to follow them. That's the agreement when we look to leadership, right? We are, as followers, we are allowing someone to take us someplace, somebody who we ultimately are going to trust to give us more than we could ever find for ourselves. And so, this, you frame it as the third incarnation of leadership. I'm sorry to tell you that, the stuff that we find in The Prince is not that different than what we are experiencing right now in terms of global pandemic, the internet revolution, new types of products, new economies, new markets, these things. It feels strange and new, but I mean, there are a lot of similarities that we can draw here.
Well, and let's talk about Machiavelli, right? So this is the reason why The Prince, and other works that he's done, like the discourses that he wrote, have lasted what, 600 years, 500 years, and we've read on this podcast already. We've read from the Bible, we've read from the Iliad, Homer, we've read from Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. So, like, this is a long stretch of books that, quite frankly, I mean, we can argue about the canon all day, but they're there because they speak to certain human truths that are immutable and, to a certain degree, immutable and unchangeable.
Potentially.
How we respond to those circumstances.
I would say potentially. I think that you're absolutely right. I think that there are great books that we look to for guidance, and we look to find information about how we can be successful as well. I think, one of the things that we can never do, though, is separate those pieces of literature from their context. And I think, if we think about The Prince, yes, it is the granddaddy of leadership books. It's one of the first prescriptive leadership books. So think of it like self-help books. And that makes it an important part of the leadership canon. However, we cannot stop from recognizing the context in which it was published. Niccolo Machiavelli was a failed diplomat. So he had just been fired from his life's work, and he was looking for something to do. So he basically decided to become a consultant and write a book.
As the world's first consultant.
The world's first leadership consultant. Oh my goodness, how are we feeling about this? And so he decided that he was going to write a book about leadership, specifically for a prince of Florence. He was writing this for one of the Medici princes. And, in that era, we're talking about, I think The Prince was published in 1515. In Europe, there's a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of upheaval. We are right on the precipice of the Renaissance, but there's a lot of change, a lot of chaos. Politics is the same as religion, is the same as the republics. We are fighting wars over these things. And in Italy at this time, the punishment for being bad at politics is death. And so when we talk about, my translation, I was reading through my translation last night, and the author talks about, Machiavelli is so dramatic, and it's either this or that. It has to be one or the other, and it's either success or death. And really, that's what was going on. Politics in Europe at that time was very dangerous. It was a dangerous place to be, and losing power might mean losing your life. And so recognizing that that's the environment that this book was written in, So as we are looking at how this book fits into our leadership style in organizations today, well, if you lose your C-suite position, chances are they're not going to kill you. So maybe we frame some of Machiavelli's advice in that way.
And I want to get into the amygdala too, because the amygdala doesn't, I mean, you can tell your amygdala that all day.
And sometimes it's hard to stop your brain from jumping to those conclusions. And so again, you talked in the beginning about how leadership is self-awareness in leadership is so important. We want to make sure, obviously, there are going to be things that leaders can't share with other people. However, those things should not be shielded from yourself. Right. And so when we talk about how we can develop effective leadership looking at personality, which is what we're going to talk about today, we got to remember that it is that self-awareness, it's that self-acceptance that really does moderate the difference between being a person with a certain personality and, shall we say, a monster.
Right. Back to the book. No, this is good. Back to the book. Because I really don't want to chunk into Machiavelli and then use that as a baseline to kind of talk about some of the things. I've taken a ton of notes while you've been talking, and we're going to, again, remember I said this podcast episode, take notes. Okay, this is how you're going to become a better leader. The Prince. And now the translation that I have is from 1998. It's the W.K. Marriott translation. I don't know if that's a good one. It's just the one that I have. I say at once, there are fewer difficulties in holding hereditary states and those long accustomed to the family of their prince than new ones. For it is sufficient only not to transgress the customs of his ancestors, and to deal prudently with circumstances as they arise for a prince of average powers to maintain himself in his state, unless he be deprived of it by some extraordinary and excessive force. And if he should be so deprived of it, whenever anything sinister happens to the usurper, he will regain it. Hereditary states. Now, you just mentioned, princes, politics, religion, all being tied in together, right? Heredity was also tied into this as well. And we are currently in our culture having a massive flux moment, and this has been coming for a while, around the value of merit in relation to income inequality. Now, we are not an economics podcast, nor are we a sociocultural podcast. I don't want to delve into those worlds that Steven Pinker and Bjorn Lomborg and other folks have delved into. I'm not getting into any of that. I'm just saying we're having this flex moment where we're judging basically our modern day version of heredity, which we define as meritocracy. For a leader at this time in this moment, if I inherit through merit, and I'm putting that in air quotes for a whole variety of reasons, but if I inherit through merit my position and my promotion, am I going to exhibit more of these behaviors, or am I going to be more inclined to do less of that? Was Machiavelli correct? Or am I going to be, more inclined to engage around the worst parts of narcissism, right? The worst, and from the literature, everybody's got a touch of narcissism. Okay. Because that's how you basically live through the world. Because if you didn't, it would just be constant negative emotion all the time. And we're going to talk about the big 5 factors of personality too here, a little bit. We're going to investigate that. But am I more likely to exhibit some type of one of these pieces of behavior, one of these pieces of the collection, as you framed it, of my personality? Or if I flex on merit, am I going to be more humble? Or maybe that's not the opposite. Maybe it's just more self-aware.
So I think let's flip that around, because really what you're talking about is outcomes versus behaviors. Okay. Mm-hmm. And this is a conversation that has been going on in leadership forever. Where does effective leadership come from? In Machiavelli's day, what we're talking about, hereditary leadership, well, that's genetic. Mm-hmm. And it used to be that up until, the early 1900s, a lot of leadership theory was based on the idea that some of these things are inherited, that your good personality, you're tall, you got a nice head of hair, it almost always was men. So
it's always
you're muscular. And these were the characteristics that made for a good leader.
Right.
Now, obviously, we've shifted to meritocracy, which means you're not born a good leader exactly. Well, we now have to wrestle with some of the complexity of where that good leadership comes from. And I think one of the challenges that Machiavelli had was that he wanted, just for the benefit of the person who was paying for this book, he wanted to be able to say, yes, you inherit good leadership. So your parents are a good leader and therefore you're going to be a good leader. It creates that kind of inherent stability. But what we know is that it's more complex than that. Mm-hmm. We have to consider a lot of different factors. And if you look at the literature of leadership, it is currently trying to mull through something called complexity leadership, which is where we find all the different things, all the different pieces of the recipe that go into this perfect type of leadership. And spoiler alert, we haven't found them all. It's so ever changing. And so when you ask, who's going to engage, basically, if you ask who's going to engage in some of these more toxic leadership traits, I think it has less to do about how you got there and more to do with how well you know who you are once you get there.
Now it has less to do with how you got there. Let me push a little bit on that. If I started an organization, let's do a thought game. I start an organization, and let's say the organization is Goldman Sachs. I'm just going to pick something outrageous.
Fine.
And I start as the janitor at Goldman Sachs. And I have a vision of a path to get to being the CEO of Goldman Sachs. Now, forget the fact that there is no path there. Forget that for just a minute. It's a cul-de-sac. I'm not getting out of it. Okay, forget that. I have enough self-confidence. Let's frame it that way. Overweening self-confidence, narcissism, to believe that there is a path that I can go up. That I can go up that
hill. A piece.
I can go up that hill, right? Okay, so I'm setting myself up. I'm doing things that would be in the Michael J. Fox movie Secret of My Success, right? I'm running around, I'm changing clothes. I've got the the Day Bow Bow song going in the background on my iPod. It's all set up, right? And somehow through the machinations, and if you haven't seen Secret of My Success or you don't know the Day Bow Bow song, it's called Oh Yeah, actually go download it on Spotify. Anyway, I've got all the dynamics set up, right? And I'm making light of this because this is how actually things work. Like in a small and medium-sized business, you will have people who will, and by the way, the IRS and the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines a small and medium-sized business as a business that has anywhere between 2 to I think it's like 1,000 employees. Like that's their range. Like it's ridiculous. And in America, 60% of people still work for small to medium-sized business organizations. They're not working for major corporations. They're not working for Goldman Sachs. But let's say through everything, I'm working for Goldman Sachs. I started as a janitor. I work my way up. I'm a CEO. I came from somewhere. I didn't come from nowhere. And so I've learned things inside of that structure. Have I learned that these dark personality traits work? Is that what I've learned on my rise up the hierarchy? Or have I learned something else? Does where you come from, does it? I think it does matter. I think it does matter where you come from because and then this gets into women and minority leaders, which I'm going to get into in just a second. But if I'm a white male working my way up from janitor to like CEO, does that matter? Does that context matter for how I exhibit these behaviors?
No. And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because you didn't work your way up from janitor for no reason. And you didn't get from janitor to CEO without having some of these characteristics that we're talking about, right? So The dark personalities, as you mentioned, we all have a little bit. Well, really, the way to think about that is that it exists on a continuum. Some people are low in narcissism. They don't have self-confidence. They don't have vision. They tend to be fine where they're at. They're not ambitious. Some people are high in narcissism without it being a disorder. And so we have to think about subclinical, non-disorder personalities as existing on a continuum. Now, what we find is people who are higher in the characteristics of these dark personalities like narcissism, like Machiavellianism, like corporate psychopathy, tend, oddly, to rise to positions of power more easily. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for that. It's because they tend to be very confident. It's because they tend to be very political, like we see in Machiavelli. It's because they tend to have less empathy for the people around them. So they're okay with being selfish and making selfish moves, self-centric moves. And these are characteristics that a lot of small corporations, large companies, multinational organizations really appreciate and value, because they feel like those characteristics are the predictors of success in those positions of power.
I didn't say secret of my success for no reason. I didn't mention that movie for no reason.
And so really, it's not that your personality doesn't change over your life. I'm sorry to tell you. If you're high in these characteristics when you're working in the mailroom, you definitely are going to be high in these characteristics when you're in the C-suite. But what we want to see is the behaviors being intentionally selected. We don't want to see people with challenging personalities behaving in whatever way they feel like, because then that becomes toxic. So the goal really, the idea of going from the janitor's closet to the C-suite, it does not change your personality. What it does is it gives you way more freedom to behave in the ways that you feel are appropriate, and the way that you feel it's appropriate to behave may not actually be effective.
Right. Okay. Now, the sub-question underneath there, women and minority leaders, because we do have a fair number of them who listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
Apparently in the literature on these subclinical traits, those traits track less to female and minority leaders, from what I've read. Now, why is that?
So there's a couple of different things to think about, right? Number one, a lot of these leadership characteristics were just developed on the skeletal frame of older white men.
Okay. So it's the skeletal frame that they were developed on, not necessarily the fact of the behaviors themselves.
It's not necessarily the behaviors themselves, but if you look at the way that leadership was defined, or the way that leadership characteristics are defined, they are characteristics that we would traditionally see in older white men. All right. And there's a reason for that. It's because that's where the leadership was 50 years ago. There were not women or minorities in positions of power, especially in this country, but in other places as well.
Sure.
So we really didn't start looking at the way that these things changed until the 80s was when it began. And even then, even now, we look at the statistical significance of women and minorities in positions of authority and leadership in this country. And the stats ain't good. It's low on both. So we have to think about, how we define leadership and what looks like leadership to us, what looks like appropriate, acceptable leadership was just modeled on people that weren't you and me. Okay. That's the first thing to think about.
Okay. Now, an anthropologist would say on a global context, when you're talking about communal versus individualistic cultural contexts, okay, they would assert, if they were sitting in my seat, they would assert that these traits shift around because of the social pressures that are inside of an anthropological context.
Right.
Okay. I just want to be clear on that. Okay. So keep going. I didn't want to interrupt your point. So that was the first piece is, the structure that we've looked at has been a narrow structure, but our structure is broadening, and we'll be broader over the course of 100 years, which is why I say we're in a third turning, because that cultural context is broadening. That's what the internet has done for us. But so it's just the structure, but what's the other piece of it?
So the other piece of it is how you behave. We talk about personality like it's the be all and end all. And personality is just a list of your preferences for how you like to do things. That's all your personality is. Personality, and this is what I tell my clients all the time, personality is not performance.
Okay.
If you look at me when I first wake up in the morning, and then you look at me in front of a group of 300 while I'm working, those are two completely different people.
Right.
And the reason for that is because I can moderate my personality preferences and go and work in front of a large group of people. I'm an ambivert, by the way. So sure. Big groups of people are very tiring for me, and I can go and work and do my job and stand and speak and answer questions, but I have to moderate my behavior because it's kind of off of my personality. And so when we talk about personality, like personalities like narcissism or Machiavellianism, well, those are a set of preferences that you have, but that doesn't mean that you have to behave in that way. And it's the same for effective leadership. There are plenty of people in organizations who behave in a certain way because they know that it's effective, even though their personality would have them do something different. Right. And so when we look at leadership effectiveness, when we look at the way that people behave, we have to separate that behavior from personality because it's just not the same thing. And so you might have an incredibly narcissistic leader who is the best leader you've ever known. Inspirational, tells you where to go, gets you there, keeps their promises, listens to you. It's just not their natural state of being.
Right.
And so I want to make sure that when we talk about leadership, we can talk about leadership through the lens of personality. We can talk about leadership through the lens of characteristics, but really the performance is a different thing.
So I want to talk about leadership and self-deception, and I want to talk about leadership and self-actualization, because I just had a thought there when you talked about the separation of, kind of, not really separation, but the framing, right, of leadership, which goes back to your initial point about framing leadership in a particular context, right? One of the questions that we always get from our clients is, well, I'm this way at home, but I'm this way at work. Is that a problem? I'm like, no, like you have different contexts. It's fine. I just say no, it's fine. But then they'll say, well, I'm a different way at a nonprofit, right? Then I'm a nonprofit board that I may serve on, or I am a different way at when I'm coaching my kids' softball team, right? And the people who tend to struggle with this, at least in our experience, the folks who tend to struggle with this the most are either female or minority leaders. They tend to have a real struggle with like this sense of being diffuse across multiple audiences. Whereas in general, white male leaders in our experience, tend not to be that hyper concerned with that diffusion, which also may be the framework that we place leadership on. It may also correlate to, I don't know, being more sensitive to negative emotion and the impacts of negative emotion from like the big 5 factors of of psychology. Who knows? I don't know. I'm just telling you what we see. And so this diffusion becomes really interesting because we live in an era of social media where everyone is on all the time, or at least there's the perception that everyone is on all the time. And leaders, I find increasingly, particularly younger leaders, are falling into this pit of, I'm not one thing across all of these audiences. And they're struggling massively. So for younger leaders, and by younger, I merely mean leaders who are generationally younger, leaders who grew up underneath and I'm going to name off the big tech companies here, the Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, always on thing that myself as a 42-year-old did not grow up under.
What's up, my millennials?
And I'm like, the only thing I owe the audience is a good time. Like I don't owe them anything else.
So I owe them the
show, right?
What you're really talking about is the understanding that people are starting to have of how exhausting it is to have to be all things to all people and never yourself.
Right.
And I think you're right. I think that there's a certain group of people, and I won't even put a generational cap on it because I'm not sure that's helpful. But the idea that you're supposed to be
I'm just saying I put a generational cap on it because it's mostly younger leaders who I hear have that anxiety, whereas older leaders that we work with tend to not express that.
So again, we had a very narrow list of behaviors and characteristics up until the 80s that were like, you needed to be tall, you needed to be forceful, you needed to be assertive, you needed to be, all these things. And these were characteristics that typically existed with more experienced, more Caucasian, more male leadership.
Right.
And what happened is that we got pretty used to seeing people like that in positions of power. And sometimes those characteristics are not authentic to people who are less male, less Caucasian, less middle-aged. And also, there are certain characteristics that are not welcomed by people who are, differently gendered and of different races. I think, you and I can pretty much understand that the word aggressive is an ain't no thing for us. We can't really, if I as a woman am described as aggressive, then I have done something wrong. If you as an African-American male are described as aggressive, then you have probably done something that is socially considered wrong. If a white man is described as aggressive, well, that's a great thing. And so we have to kind of toe this line, I think, as leadership changes. We're going to have to become more accepting of different types of personalities, regardless of the things that we cannot change. So again, we want to talk about identity and the characteristics of ourselves that we can't change. You're going to talk about race. You're going to talk about gender. You're going to talk about sexual identity. You're going to talk about able-bodiedness. There's a bunch of others. But the goal, I think, and the place that I see the literature really moving is that we're talking about authenticity. We're talking about at work and at home being as close together as possible. We're talking about relieving you of the burden of having to be something that you're not, because that's a ton of energy that you're wasting trying to change something that cannot be changed. It would be the same as if I had to dress physically as a man every day for work and, put on some kind of a suit for that. It would be the same as somebody asking you to change your skin color for work. You can do it, but that doesn't feel good. It won't look good. You're not going to feel authentic. You're not going to feel
Eddie Murphy had an entire bit on that on Saturday Night Live back in the day.
I know. And you know what the crazy thing is? The crazy thing is that he was completely welcomed and completely accepted once he did that. Well, of course, if you're going to conform to this rigid idea of what a leader is that is based entirely on somebody that you are not, you can do it.
Yeah.
The goal of my work in the leadership industry, the goal of yours, I'm sure as well, is to give people a different option. And for me, the option is, let us play to your natural personality. Let us understand what your natural personality is. And let's give you some behaviors that you can use that are going to accomplish your goals within that natural personality.
And thus we have to start with this idea of, because you mentioned the different ways in which identity, which by the way is also socially constructed, so that's another negotiation, and I come out of the space, the negotiation. I come out of the
negotiation. You just invented these names.
I come out of the negotiation and conflict management space, so there's you're negotiating your social identity while you're also trying to internally negotiate your own identity. And in order to even do that identity negotiation work effectively, we have to be self-aware. So let's talk about that a little bit. Back to the book. But the difficulties occur from, again, Machiavelli, but the difficulties occur in a new principality. And firstly, if it be not entirely new, but is, as it were, a member of a state, which taken collectively may be called composite, the changes arise chiefly from an inherent difficulty which there is in all new principalities. For men change their rulers willingly, hoping to better themselves, and this hope induces them to take up arms against him who rules, wherein they are deceived, because they afterwards find by experience they have gone from bad to worse. This follows also on another natural and common necessity, which always causes a new prince to burden those who have submitted to him with his soldiery and with infinite other hardships, which he must put upon his new acquisition. Machiavelli is going directly to relationships there, by the way. He's saying that it's not just the prince, it's the prince and the followers, and we're co-creating reality together. Not to get all mystical on you, but we're co-creating reality together. Okay.
That's not mystical, that's scientific.
Well, it sounds vaguely, when you say it, co-creating reality, it sounds vaguely, oh, we're going to, no, you're right. There's hard science behind it. And there's this idea of leader-member exchange, right? Where we're exchanging emotional content. We're creating relationship, in essence, what we said at the beginning. Well, this goes to self-awareness and self-deception on the part of both leaders and followers. So are followers deceived? And if they are, is responsible leadership the leadership that wakes them up from their deception? And how can a leader do that if they are also self-deceived? If both the followers and the leaders are self-deceived, which we see in a lot of organizations. A big example that I think of is an organization that no longer exists anymore. Enron. Everybody at Enron was running around engaging in self-deception. Followers and leaders alike. Everybody was playing the game. Another example that I think of is Wells Fargo. And I've never worked with Wells Fargo. Full disclaimer here, I don't know anybody who's worked for Wells Fargo. I've just read a ton of case studies on Wells Fargo and taught a ton of case studies on Wells Fargo around ethics. And if you look at the ethical structure of Wells Fargo, consistently over the course of time, everybody there is self-deceived. Followers and leaders alike. How do we break that? Because Wells Fargo has billions of dollars under management and controls a lot of money, which leads to a lot of control of other things. Okay. Or Enron dang near wrecked the entire economy. I was alive at the time. I have historical memory. I was there.
I was in business school at the time.
Right. How do we fix that? Because that's a massive lack of self-awareness all the way up and down a massive hierarchy. And if we frame it to mythology, we could say that, or not even mythology, if we frame it to something like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, and basically looked at the tyranny of the Soviet Union and said everybody was involved in the tyranny, from the lowest person on the street to the highest person in the Politburo. Everybody was involved in the tyranny. Or if you look at under communism, the East German secret police, the Stasi, claimed that they had literally 50% of the population informing on the other 50% of the population.
Yeah.
And everybody was participating in the tyranny. Now, we can see it in a state, and we can say that's not correct. We can clearly see that that kind of tyranny doesn't work at a nation-state level. And yet...
Doesn't it, though?
It doesn't. The Soviet Union collapsed.
But...
I mean, it took it 70 years for everybody to break up.
You've heard the phrase, the system works exactly as it's supposed to.
The system works if you're at the top, and the people in the top of the system get hurt last.
Oh, no. The system works in general. So here's what
And by the way, Solzhenitsyn would push back. He would say, I wrote the Gulag Archipelago. That's its proof that the system doesn't work, that it ossifies and it collapses.
So here's the thing, is that it works until it doesn't work. And
okay.
So what we're talking about here, so there's got to be a fundamental. So let's start at the beginning, right?
Yeah, let's start with fundamentals. Yeah.
Let's start with the fundamentals of truth, right? Yep. So we're all searching, you as a professional, me as a student, there are philosophers out there through the ages who are all searching for truth with a capital T, right? Yep. Religion's got it. Organizational cultures found it. We're working on creating a philosophy around ourselves that is just truth with a capital T. I personally don't believe in truth with a capital T. I come from the attitude that there's too many things that are subjective. There are too many things that I have to make assumptions about in order to get to what I believe is the truth. And there's too many variables, and I'm just never going to get there. So really, if we're talking about the truth of the nature of leadership, I think that you and really deception, which is what you're saying, that deception is withholding that truth from people, whether it is a leader withholding the truth from their followers or followers withholding the truth from themselves, being self-deceived. The nature of truth to me is that you're just never going to get to the there. And so stop looking for objective truth and start recognizing the subjective truths. The subjective truths that you're referring to are the things that make it psychologically possible for us to exist. The idea of self-deception is that if we actually knew the truth, our heads would explode. We wouldn't be able to psychologically cope. The amount of complexity and the lack of control in the world that we live in is just crazy. And if we knew everything that was going on, we would just go insane. So start from that place and recognize that self-deception can serve a purpose in that way as kind of psychological protection. And so here's the part where the leader comes in. Well, the leader has control over a lot of information, and they can create as much protection for their people as they want. And here's where we get into difficulty, because how much protection are you providing your followers versus are you withholding things that they really need? You're absolutely right. There are structures and systems that have protected their followers to the point where their followers didn't appreciate it anymore because they didn't have any freedoms anymore. And then they had to overthrow that system and start over again, which is, by the way, what Machiavelli talks about when he talks about the difference between a principality, an organization run by a prince, and a republic. He's making that case. We sacrifice freedom, we sacrifice our individual freedoms for that safety and stability. And it's going to be a constant give and take. It's going to be a constant give and take from me as an individual and from me in the whatever group that I'm in. And what Machiavelli saw is that sometimes if there's a difference in opinion between what a prince thinks you need as far as security and information versus what the people need, well, now we got to fight it out.
But so many followers say they want the truth. They will tell the leader for sure. They will tell the leader verbally and non-verbally through their lived behavior, I want the truth, which gets back to the core of my question. Does a responsible leader wake up the people? Does a responsible leader tell them the truth? Because they there's a principle in sales and marketing, give the people what they want.
And I would say you can take it from, you could probably take it even further. And I would say it's maybe not the responsible leader, but the smart leader does wake people up because they realize that the potential that they're looking for comes from an awoken followership. It comes from a followership that feels empowered in their own power and their own freedom. It comes from a followership that feels trusting towards the leadership. It comes from the characteristics that you create when you allow people to be exactly who they are and do what they want to do within the confines of the goals that you have for the organization.
Now that requires some emphasis on feedback, because that requires you to break the feedback loop, right? So if the feedback loop is overwhelmingly positive over behaviors that are negative, and you are the leader who is now tasked with the unenviable task, and sometimes we will have leaders that will come to us and they will say, hey son, I've been given this team. It's a dysfunctional, toxic mess. And I was hired to fix this dysfunctional, toxic mess. And these people can't handle the truth. And quite frankly, hey son, I live in a world where I have to eat and pay my rent. And if I wake these people up, I will not be here very much longer. I will not be here to make money so that I can pay my rent. And I've got little kids, and they'll give us the entire like spectrum of things that are like Lilliputians holding the Gulliver of leadership that is inside of them down. And The thing we tell them is incrementalism. You can't wake people up. I'm thinking of the Matrix here now. Again, movie references. You can't wake people up all at once. You can't, because the shock is too much. I understand you just want to rip the Band-Aid off. I'm impatient. I get it. Like, I'm naturally impatient. I just want to rip the Band-Aid off and be done, But I'm also a bit of a direct communicator. So that also gets me into trouble. Don't do what I would do. Instead, be an incrementalist, right? Gradually wake people up. Now, the dark side of being an incrementalist is you're pushing on the system as a leader, trying to wake people up. And the system is pushing on you, trying to keep you asleep, trying to keep you conforming and complying and all these kinds of things. So there's a balance here. And, well, not even a balance. There's a tension. It's not a balance, it's a tension. There's a tension here. And without self-awareness, without knowledge of who you are and how far you can go, at the very minimum, and what you will tolerate and what you won't, I don't see leaders as having success. Or am I incorrect? Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us. That's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
I would say that what you are discussing is how to take a team that is not effective and create effectiveness there.
Well, it's even more about, it's even more than being effective. It's how do we take a team that is focused on things that you framed it as subjective truths, right? That may be hardened into objective facts for them. How do we chip away at that? Because that's what's creating the dysfunctional behavior, and that's what's creating the toxicity, and it's just a cycle that's just not breaking. And by the way, I'm the leader who's been brought in to break it. So congratulations, welcome to my lucky day.
If you've been brought in to break it, then break it. Here's the thing that I will say, and this is what I'm hearing from this example, is you have a leader who says, oh, well, I'm going to change some stuff, and change causes disruption, and this team would not handle disruption well. So I got to figure out a way of doing this that's not going to disrupt them. Mm-hmm. Right? At a deeper level, what I hear that kind of a leader saying is, I don't trust my team to have the right reaction to the truth. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to change the truth so that I get the right reaction. Now, can you tell me a word for that?
Yeah, that's lying.
It's lying / manipulation. And by the way, it's manipulation that is 100% supported by this lovely book right there. The problem with that is that what you're doing is you're basically taking one toxic situation and you're replacing it with another toxic situation. And that's never going to help you. Right. What you need to do is to create an opportunity where you can, you're right, break the cycle, not just the feedback cycle. You're going to break every cycle. Yeah. You're going to break the communication cycle. You're going to break the production cycle. You're going to break the social cycles. You're going to break everything down. and rebuild it again. And you're 100% right. There's going to be a ton of disruption there. And it is your job as the leader to be the person who says, now hang on. I know this is scary. I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's change, but you got to trust me here because I know where we're going. Come with me if you dare. And there will be some people who go, not for me. I'm going to go to another team. I'm going to leave the organization. I'm going to fall off the planet, whatever their decision. But that's not your choice as a leader to make. Because again, your job is to try and present as objective a truth as you can possibly find. And it is, as a relationship, this is the leader-follower relationship, it is the follower's job to consent to taking in that truth. If you're lying at any level, if your followers aren't giving you the truth, or if you're not giving your followers the truth, we're just creating a different toxic situation.
And this is the challenge inside of the leadership development field, because the people who are paying, our leadership consultancies checks, and the people who are paying Erika's leadership consultancies checks don't want their organizations broken. They fundamentally do not want that.
They don't want them to stay broken, for sure.
Well, right. And so we have a whole training that we do, development that we do around adapting to change. And we talk about this idea of, from Peter Thiel, of finding your zero. And then we talk about Nicholas Nassim Taleb and black swans and anti-fragility and how do you build small teams. And previous to COVID, and I've mentioned this to you before, previous to COVID, people would literally have a riot. And this is the last class that we do in our leadership toolbox. People would literally have a riot in class, which is why we don't front load that. we put adapting to change all the way at the end. So you do these 11 other things and they all collapse into, now I can adapt to change, right? Knowing your role and responsibilities, being self-aware, understanding how to manage conflict, which for me, because I'm a conflict guy and that's the hammer I've got and everything I see is a nail. When you cause that disruption, you're going to create conflict. You just are. And you have to know your conflict management style, and you have to know your approach, and you have to know other people's approach and all this. Okay. Persuasion tactics, dealing with difficult people, high conflict people, not people who have narcissism as a psychological issue, but people who are narcissistic, people who are passive.
Higher in narcissism.
Higher narcissism, right. You have to understand how to give positive performance reviews and how to deal with discipline and how to hand out feedback. You have to understand the difference between motivation and morale. They're not the same thing. And even though they're often collapsed together as the same thing, you have to understand how to coach people for accountability. You have to understand how to manage a diverse workforce. And then after you understand all of that, then you can adapt people to change.
Mm-hmm.
Previous to COVID, when we would give that module, there would be there would be riots. So we put it at the end. And you still get a lot of kerfluffle. In a post-COVID environment, there's no kerfluffle anymore. Most people sit very attentively and pay close attention because something just happened external that just smacked everybody in the mouth. And now there's been a bit of humbling, I would assert, at all levels, nation state, all the way down to the individual. And I put this in my book, 12 Rules for Leaders. That's coming up here in April 2022. That's the pitch for the book. The problem that we have, I think, is a problem, particularly in the West now, not globally, but in the West, Europe, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. The problem we have is a problem of abundance. You mentioned earlier that we can't have everything, but we are told consistently we can. And thus we place demands on leaders and organizations that they cannot fulfill. Mm-hmm. And followers do this innately because, quite frankly, we've been trained by our devices that we can have everything that we want.
Oh, don't give it to the devices. People have wanted this for millennia.
Yeah, they wanted it for a millennia, but now it's been facilitated. This is where I'll put it on the device, because I do think the device facilitates it. Our technology facilitates it. First, the technology was TV that facilitated it. Before that, it was radio that facilitated it. The technology facilitates it. Maybe the only difference between radio and TV or newspapers is the speed with which the facilitation occurs, but the facilitation is still there. That's what the technology does. It facilitates it.
And by the way, right before this book was written was the advent of the technology of the printing press,
Right.
which completely changed the way that everybody got information.
The printing press and shipbuilding. So it's interesting when I mentioned this on other podcasts, but when I hesitate to call it a plague, the pandemic began, I was reading the Decameron, which is a fascinating book about the bubonic plague. Well, it's not really about the bubonic plague, but it's about other things, but that's what underlies all of it. Previous to the bubonic plague, shipbuilding was not a big deal in Europe. And that's just one example of one industry. It just wasn't. Like, people didn't, I mean, they were on the continent, they didn't care. About, what was it, 20? Oh, no, not 20. 18 years, right? Yeah, 18 years. No, more than that. 20, I'm doing my math in my head. 23 years. 23 years. Before Machiavelli wrote his book, Christopher Columbus goes on a boat, and we can argue about whether or not that's a good thing. He just went on the boat, and he goes around, well, thought he was going around the world. He didn't wind up around the world. That was another transformative act, because people from Europe were like, oh, there's all this other stuff over here.
So now when we talk about change, which is what we're discussing now, okay, right. So we have now change in the way that we communicate, change in the amount of information that we have, change in the speed of moving and being able to go different places and try new things. So change in the culture, right?
It's a problem of abundance. We've got too much. We can't handle it.
Oh no. We must have a leader who can pull back all that abundance for us, who can free us from the burden of our own freedom.
We must have gatekeepers. Yes. There are people who fundamentally believe this.
Awesome, and not at all like something that anybody could potentially abuse. This is what Machiavelli figured out, right? So he was a student of history. He was an experienced politician. He was living through tremendous chaotic times, and he was a leadership consultant. So he had a job to do, which was to figure out how he could facilitate followership. Mm-hmm. And what he figured out is exactly what everybody figures out during times of chaotic change. The easiest way to get people to do what you want is to force them. Mm-hmm. It is 100% the easiest way to run an organization. It is the best. One person, all the decisions, everybody just does what they're told, and it works great.
Except it creates a tyranny where the individual who's running the state can't, or the individuals, let's look at the Politburo again. I'm looking at you, Politburo, doesn't actually know how to make decisions. Economists have noted this. Doesn't actually know how to make decisions, and thus makes bad ones consistently.
Doesn't make good decisions, doesn't make the good decisions fast enough, doesn't know what they're doing, doesn't frame it in the right way. There are a bajillion ways for an individual leader to screw up leadership.
Now, wait a minute. Stalin solved this at a nation state level. He just killed 100 million people.
Yeah, you can also, that's the end result, right? So what Machiavelli said was, you know what? If you want power and you want to hang on to it, there's only one way to do that, and that is to decimate the population that you're trying to rule. Mm-hmm. Ruling out of fear is 100% the most effective way to rule a country, to keep control and power over people. You got to just terrify them to the point where they will never even think to challenge you. And he's 100% right. That is the easiest way, the most effective way to keep power, except for the fact that keeping power is different than being an effective leader. And so now we find ourselves in the same place, right? Mm-hmm. We thought for the longest time, and I, have studied the change theorists in our, work. We talk about change a lot. And there was a time that we believed that change was punctuated, and we would have long non-change periods. And then there was change, but then things would not change anymore. And then there was more change. And now we recognize that we were wrong. The theorists were wrong. The academics were wrong.
You mean Carol Gersick was wrong? Punctuated equilibrium model is not a method of change?
Carol. I apologize.
And she was mad at Bruce Tuckman. She was like, Tuckman's a moron.
And you know what? And I promise you in 50 years, we're going to have a different thing. But here's where we're at now. Change is constant. It's constant. It's constant in your organization, whether you like to think it is or not. And it's constant outside of the organization, as we learned very rapidly with our COVID-19 pandemic. Change is constant. And so the most effective thing that a leader can do is figure out how to build a system that is resilient in change, that is responsive to change, so that you can change things when you need to, and you can resist changing things that don't need to be changed, so that you can hopefully lengthen the life of your organization.
And you still got those pesky followers.
Oh, man.
Back to the prince for just a minute, because he's got an idea about that.
Let's hear it.
And you just said rule through fear. So he's got an idea about that. The wish to acquire is in truth very natural and common. And men always do so when they can. And for this they will be praised, not blamed. But when they cannot do so, yet wish to do so by any means, then there is folly and blame. For in truth, there is no safe way to retain them, and he's talking about cities, other than by ruining them. But you can apply that to organizations or teams or even individuals, as we were just saying. And he who becomes master of a city, accustomed to freedom, and does not destroy it, may expect to be destroyed by it. For in rebellion, it has always the watchword of liberty, and its ancient privileges as a rallying point. By the way, this is 1515, before the American Revolution, the British Revolution,
before
and the French
America
Revolution. Right, exactly, before any of that. Which neither time nor benefits will ever cause it to forget. And whatever you may do or provide against, they will never forget that name or their privileges unless they are disunited or dispersed. But at every chance, they immediately rally to them, as Pisa, after the 100 years she had been held in bondage by the Florentines. But when cities or countries are accustomed to live under a prince, and his family is exterminated, they being on the one hand accustomed to obey, and on the other hand not having the old prince, cannot agree in making one from amongst themselves, and they do not know how to govern themselves. For this reason they are very slow to take up arms, and a prince can gain them to himself and secure them much more easily. But in republics there is much more vitality, greater hatred, and more desire for vengeance, which will never permit them to allow the memory of their former liberty to rest, so that the safest way is to destroy them or to reside there. We see this with corporate takeovers. We see this with corporate mergers. I think of Amazon acquiring Whole Foods. When Amazon acquired Whole Foods, there was a very small story, and almost nobody paid attention to it except for maybe you saw it, and maybe me, and we were about the only two people in America that saw it. And it's worth commenting on, by the way, here at this point. When Amazon, the giant whale that Amazon is, acquired Whole Foods, literally the day after the acquisition went through, a third of the Whole Foods executives left. They just pieced out. They pieced out of the former republic. They're like, nope, we don't want to be under this tyranny. They didn't attempt to try to change Amazon. They didn't even attempt to mount a rebellion. I'm sure they got stock options and wonderful packages and all these other kinds of things, but associating it with a monetary reward is a little bit of a venal thing, and we do a lot of that in our culture anyway, which I also object to, because I think there's more motivations than just money, and I don't even think that money is the primary motivation for most people. I think that there's other motivations that are way deeper and way less examined at a psychological level than money. But okay, we're going to do the venal one. Fine, they got their packages and they left. But you look at Amazon's response to that, and they were, as usual, they were dead quiet. They just sort of let it happen, and they're like, okay, yeah, moving on. I don't know. Rebellion. If a leader doesn't know his own people or her own people, we're not gender specific here, doesn't know his or her own people, there's gonna be people. Rebellion. How does a leader navigate rebellion? You know, and we just brought up, I mean, we're just talking about, you know, self-awareness in this little space here. And telling followers the truth. Well, when you tell followers the truth, they're going to rebel. Okay, how do you navigate rebellion? And even, by the way, the military looks at this as well, all the way up to literal mutiny. How do you handle that? And where does narcissism, where does Machiavellianism, where does, corporate psychopathy, do these behaviors help you handle a rebellion and help you navigate it and help you manage it? Or are they just more gas on the fire? Are they an accelerant to the rebellion?
I mean, so let's talk about what we mean by rebellion, because what we don't actually mean rebellion. We mean resistance to change, right? So when Amazon acquired Whole Foods executives left because they were resistant to change, and their response was, we don't have enough power to stop that change, so we're going to remove ourselves, which is not rebellion. That's fine. What we're talking about, though, is we're talking about resistance to change. And these are changes that must happen because, as you pointed out, the world is very complex right now. It's moving fast. Stuff's gotta go, whether people are interested in that movement or not. And so what I talk to my clients about is the 10-80-10 rule. All right. Mm-hmm. And this is going to be useful for any leader who is trying to manage and lead and run an organization in a time of chaotic change where stuff just has to happen. We talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. There were things that just had to happen. They had to have virtual meeting software. So somebody had to make that decision, and we couldn't really wait on consensus because everybody's at home. We had to have certain things. We had to have paychecks come in, and decisions had to be made.
Yeah.
I function on the 10-80-10 rule for leadership, right? So when you're at the head of an organization, if you're making the decisions here in times of chaotic and uncertain change, you can find this, and you can see this in the polling for whatever politician is doing, whatever thing they're doing. You will see 10% of the organization is already on board. You can say whatever you want. You can blow that presentation. It could be a horrible idea, but they're still on board. They're going to follow you no matter what. 10%.
The way I frame it is they think you walk on water.
You are their Jesus Christ. Bring them to salvation. You can do no wrong. 10%. Right. Okay. There's another 10% of the organization that is the exact opposite. Right. You're never going to get them. They don't like you. They don't trust you. They're not here for this. The answer for them will always be no. And it doesn't matter what you say.
Well, and because we don't understand why liking works and doesn't, we actually don't really get
likability is
level.
Yes.
We don't we're pulling apart we're probably part of the biological level with the neurochemistry and the neuroscience, but we still don't really know.
It's everything. Likability is how loud I speak. It's the sound of my voice. It's the way that I look. It's the way that I smell. It's how I walk. It's the decisions that I make. It's the climate that we're in. It's everything. And
it's the first 10 to 20 milliseconds of an interaction.
And you're right. It is complex, and it's not well understood, and so I'm not going to touch it. But 10% of people love you and are always on board with whatever you say they should be on board with. 10% of people hate you.
Yeah, they didn't like the cut of your jib when you showed up.
they didn't like you when they saw you, and they haven't changed their mind since, and the answer is always going to be no from them. But the other 80% of your organization is going to listen to a rational argument.
Right.
And so here's the challenge with leaders who are trying to lead in times of chaotic change. You can't just listen to the 10% that always loves you, because you're not getting that good objective information that we've talked about. We want to find that objective truth. And the people who think you walk on water aren't going to give it to you.
Right.
We're also not going to try and get the 10% that just hate everything that you do. Because honestly, the old joke, what is a camel? It's a horse designed in committee. Wow,
that is an old joke. Yeah, I've heard that in years. Yeah.
We go from horse to camel because we're trying to pick up people that they're not ever on board. And you're going to change the quality of the decision making if you try to bring them on. Okay. And you're still not going to get them.
The thing we tell folks is we tell them literally, tell them the boat is leaving. Say to them, we would like you to be on board.
We would like for you to be on board.
We would love you to be a part of it, but the boat's going that way.
But if we lose you.
And this becomes really interesting because at that level of persuasion where consensus sits, leaders fall into the 99%, or I'm a failure trap. And I tell them all you need is 50 plus 1. And they stare at me like I've grown a third head. Because it's like, oh no, I can't possibly do that. I'm like there's all of the objections. So I don't want to step on your point, but we do say, if you're using consensus as a method of persuasion, that's a trap.
And that's true. That. So really, let's not think of it as consensus. Let's think about it as 90%. This 10% already on board. This 10% never going to happen. This 80% is going to respond to your rational arguments.
Well, and they want to be convinced by competency. I think fundamentally that 80% wants to be convinced that you're competent and that you're able to be able. Well, I think that does convince people. Data convinces some people. Hugs convince other people. And some people need to be convinced by it's a mishmash in there, right?
And so the goal is to make a good rational argument based on what you perceive as the needs of the organization as you can assess them right now. Okay? Right. And so you don't need 50 plus 1. That's probably a bit low. What we're really talking about is 90%. We're talking about 90% on any given issue you're going to get through a well-reasoned rational argument. And your job as a leader is to not just listen to the 10% that already love you, which some people, when they get overwhelmed, they tend to go back to their safe, happy place, which are the people who are going to tell you what you want to hear. Mm-hmm. And we can't really amend the quality of the decision to convince people who are just never going to be convinced.
Well, and I would add in a third one, don't fall into the ease of coercion.
And we don't want to manipulate to get the outcome that we think is best because we don't know everything.
Right.
I don't care how competent you are. I don't care how long you've been doing this. You don't know everything. You can't. So we want to be open to receiving all the information from all the groups of people, but just consider that at any given moment, your decision, if it's well-reasoned and well-justified, is going to be appealing to 90% of your organization. And that's enough. That's fine. That's more than enough.
Machiavelli would say this: those who by valorous ways become princes, like these men, acquire principality with difficulty, but they keep it with ease. The difficulties they have in acquiring it rise in part from the new rules and methods which they are forced to introduce to establish their government and its security. And it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things, because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions. And lukewarm has for defenders in those that may do well under the new. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience of them. Thus, it happens that whenever those who are hostile have the opportunity to attack, they do it, like partisans, whilst the others defending lukewarmly, in such wise that the prince is endangered along with them.
How are we responding to change? That's exactly what that question asks. How can we respond best to change?
Let's get a little tactical here, since I have you for a few more moments. Let's look at this tetrarch or triad, whichever it is. And I'm looking here, glancing over here on my other screen, at the work of the writing of Manfred F.R. Ketz de Vries. He appears to be Dutch fellow, writer and researcher in this space of how do you coach a toxic leader? How do you deal with this dark triad, right, of behaviors that Erika and I have been talking about for the last little bit here. And so at this moment in the podcast, I'd like to get a little practical for folks who are listening. And I'm going to ask you, I'm just going to go through each one. So let's start off with this one. How do you spot a narcissist? So if I'm in an organization, how do I spot the narcissist? I mean, I may have a general idea of what narcissism is, but I may not have a word to put with it. I didn't go to no fancy psychological school. I didn't read no fancy books. Tell me in plain English, how do I spot a narcissist if I'm listening to this podcast?
With a personality test.
But that person's not going to let me just walk up to them and be like, take this and then just walk away. So
isn't that crazy?
I know they're going to refuse. They're going to rebel. They're going to pull a thing, and they're going to be like, what? Get away from me.
They're going to be like, hey, that's my personal private self. And no, you don't have a right to it, which they're 100% right. So let us not, and this is my bugaboo. This is my pet peeve. Mm-hmm. Let us not confuse performance with personality. Again, okay. I just have to come back to this. How do I, from the outside, spot somebody's internal private interactions with themselves and internal private needs without giving them a personality test? Well, spoiler alert, you don't.
Okay.
So let's talk about what you're really asking about, which is the behaviors, right?
Right. How do I spot narcissistic behaviors then?
Well, okay. So number one, narcissism is a personality type that is characterized by a lack of empathy for others and a desire to protect one's self. So it really comes to a place of being self-interested. Now, as you mentioned earlier, when we talk about being self-interested, it gets a little dicey because we're all self-interested.
Yeah, we all care about ourselves. We're all selfish.
There you go. So the goal really is to understand that it's ourself first, but not by itself. It's ourself first, not alone. So when we talk about the characteristics of a narcissist that people dislike so much, it's really the selfishness. It's the self-centeredness. It is being somebody who cares about themselves and no one else. And so if you ask me, how do I spot a narcissist? You don't spot a narcissist, but you can spot narcissistic behaviors, not caring about the needs of others. Sometimes, we can't. Sometimes the decisions that have to be made irrespective of how much we like the people around us or how much we want to do for them. Sometimes the bad decisions have to be made. However, what we want is for somebody to recognize that while their own needs are important, they're not the only things that need to be concerned about.
How do we spot the behavior of a Machiavellian personality? Or, sorry, Machiavellian behavior, I guess, not personality. How do we spot Machiavellian behavior?
So to be Machiavellian is to be somebody who is kind of callously interested in maneuvering people in order to get those outcomes. So the idea of, the path doesn't matter. It's the outcome that's the most important thing, right? This is very characteristic of American businesses. It doesn't matter how we got here. We just need to achieve our goals. That is the heartbeat of a Machiavellian personality. It is a person who does not particularly care or recognizes that their care of other people isn't going to achieve the goals that they're looking for. And so they're okay with operating outside of those relationships, which really means they're okay with operating outside of the social norms that we've created, which is how we get some of those illegal behaviors.
And then how do we spot the behaviors of a corporate psychopath?
A corporate psychopath is, again, I want to be very clear, subclinical. So we're not talking about a clinically deranged and disturbed person. We're not talking about, murderers and serial killers. And a corporate psychopath is somebody who has a clinical lack of empathy. And that's it. They don't feel what other people feel. And so it never comes into account when they talk about decision making. A corporate psychopath is somebody who can't understand that you don't like something because the question is not for them whether they like it or not. They don't feel that way. The question for them is, does it work? Is it productive? Is it achieving their goals? And so when you talk about subclinical psychopathy, what we're really talking about is somebody who doesn't take emotions or feelings into consideration when they're making their decisions.
And finally, probably ones that I think maybe more at a mid-managerial level in the organizational culture folks might run into, although you're going to run into all these kinds of behaviors everywhere in the culture, from the front line all the way up to the top. Looking at the two that Manfred was speaking about in his Harvard Business Review article here, that I think that again we get a lot of questions about, and we find that people struggle quite a bit in addressing the behaviors of these individuals. How does someone address the behavior of a passive aggressive individual, or an individual who's exhibiting passive aggressive behavior?
Individual behaviors, especially something as general as passive aggression. The question is, why are they being passive aggressive as opposed to aggressive or passive? Right. The usual situation, this is a completely different podcast, by the way.
Yeah.
But usually people are passive aggressive because aggression isn't appropriate in the situation that they're in. Mm-hmm. And so they have to resort to passive aggression or jokes in order to make their point. Mm-hmm. So if you find that you're in an organization or you're on a team with somebody who is constantly passive aggressive, I would say that there is an issue that must be dealt with, and that your team probably needs to be better about sharing the real situations that are going on and being okay with people who are in conflict.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's one of the areas where we do some of our best work, because people are uncomfortable in general, we have found, with conflict. And really at a fundamental level uncomfortable with confrontation, because confrontation is not conflict. Those are two different things, and people struggle mightily to separate those two ideas in their heads.
Well, and conflict and confrontation, one of the things so in the way that I coach, mm-hmm. I coach around the characteristics of self-actualization, one of which is candor, mm-hmm. which is being completely upfront and giving the honest truth as you see it to another person. Mm-hmm. So honesty, truly.
Right.
And the other one is comfort with conflict. And mm-hmm. so again, conflict can be yelling and screaming. Conflict can just be me saying, I challenge you on this thing because I don't agree with you. Mm-hmm. The idea is to create constructive conflict and candor. And these are some of the foundation pieces of what I would call psychological safety in an organization. If you find that people don't trust leadership, if you find that people aren't giving feedback, honest feedback, if you find that people aren't telling the truth or are even worse, telling lies, then you have an organization that is lacking in psychological safety. It's not safe for people to behave in an honest, upfront, open, candid, constructively conflict-oriented way, because the organization isn't allowing them to behave that way. The team isn't allowing them to behave that way. So when you see, and this goes for narcissists, Machiavellians, corporate psychopaths, everyday sadists, and you and me both, when you have people engaging in counterproductive work behaviors, being passive aggressive, starting fights, not getting their work done, being mean to the people around them, these are counterproductive work behaviors. These are irrational responses to rational problems. There's a real problem there that you as a leader need to get to the bottom of.
Finally, Manfred spoke about this, and I'll just read directly from his quote directly from Manfred here. Alexithymics are literal-minded, displaying little imagination, and typically are unable to describe or even recognize their feelings. This inability makes it difficult for them to interpret the many and often complex emotional signals they receive from others, which they perceive as dangerous, potentially uncontrollable forces. If I'm working for one of those folks, what do I do with that?
Oh, with alexithymics, you don't have to do anything.
Alexithymics, I mispronounced it. So by the way, that's Greek for no word for emotions, just in case you're listening. Go ahead.
Which is not the same as a corporate psychopath. So here's the continuum there. And there is an excellent book by a man named Nasir Ghami. It's called A First-Rate Madness, where he talks about alexithymics, hyperthymic or thalmic, and hypothalamic. Okay. Now, when we talk about this, what we're really talking about is the ability to perceive emotion and to process emotion. People who are hypothymic are naturally depressive. All right. And one of the examples that Nasir Ghami gave in his book was Martin Luther King Jr. was a hypothalamic, a little bit on the depressive side, suffered from bouts of depression, historically had challenges with dealing with complex emotions that he was having. I mean, naturally just on the depressive side. When we look on the other side of that, we have hyperthalamics who are just naturally up. And the example of a hyperthalamic from the same generation was JFK Jr. Naturally up, like to be out, like to be extroverted, like to know the ladies, just had a little extra energy, just needed
a lot of external stimulation.
Needed a place to put that. The example of an alexithymic is somebody who they just kind of, you could call it a balanced personality, but really I would say it's a lack of personality. And the example of somebody who is alexithymic would be a person like George W. Bush, or another example from the book was Tony Blair. These are people who are perfectly fine. There's nothing psychologically wrong with them. They're just not that interesting. They are not really on the depressive side. They're not really on the kind of manic side. They just sort of are, and that's fine, and that's sturdy, and that's stable, but it's not very interesting. And more importantly, it's not very inspiring.
I was going to say something about a visionary leader, but
let's talk about it.
I'm going to leave that. Well, we're almost to the close here, and I want to leave you on a high note there. So we will have you back because I want to address. Jeffrey Pfeffer has some interesting information about the visionary leader that I would love to be able to talk with you about. I am convinced that a leader should have vision, should have a direction or an idea of where to go, and that vision should be clear. So you talk about coaching from a space of candor. I would add, and we've talked about this before, but I would add clarity and courage as two other C's on there. The clarity inside of your own head to actually know what it is you want to say candidly, and then the courage to actually say it. And if you can link the three of those together, we call it the 3 C's methodology. That's what we do over here.
And in my coaching, we do link those 3 together with 6 other attributes of self-actualization for leadership performance.
Awesome. So now I want to have you back on because I want to talk about that idea of visionary versus vision, which are 2 different things. And sometimes how leaders drink their own Kool-Aid too much. They drink their own visionary.
Then we can talk about narcissism.
And we can talk about narcissism. We can talk about narcissism more in depth.
Which is what I really like to talk about.
Well, let me close here. So, how do we stay on the path if we are following a leader who may be exhibiting some behaviors? How do we stay on the path if we are leaders who are watching other leaders? And this very often happens in organizations and cultures. We are leading one team one way and another team in the organization is being led a completely and totally different way. And we seem to have no influence with that other leader, even though we may be peers. How do we stay on the path? I'm a big fan of mythology. We didn't talk about that on this podcast, but I'm a big fan of mythology because I think that myths instantiate emotions for people in a way that they can understand, which is why fables and stories and storytelling isn't going to go anywhere. I appreciate people who object to it and want to use raw data, qualitative and quantitative, want social science research, and we've talked a lot about that today. And you do you do need that. But there are people who will not be convinced by data. They will be convinced by mythology, and they will be convinced by stories. And there's a evolutionary reason, talk about hard science, why this stuff actually works. So to stay on the path, I want you to think about this as we close today. The mythology of the hero has 2 variants, which we talked about today, the light and the dark. This is most accurately presented to the modern and postmodern mind via the mythology, which I'm a personal fan of comic books and movies. I'm a huge fan of comic books, if you know anything about me. Most notably, the 2 different sides of this, Batman and Superman. Now, I'm going to make this very broad. Trust me, there's little tiny things that are different about all of them, but maybe you don't care about Superman Beyond the movie, or maybe you really like Christopher Nolan's Batman. Superman is the force of light, representing truth, justice, the American way. Batman is the force of the dark, though, representing vengeance, the night, and, interestingly enough, sheepdogs who guard the sheep. Leaders are convinced existentially, philosophically, and practically that leadership is all light. And those who are convinced of this, they really do need a gut check. It's not all Superman. Leadership isn't all collaboration and good times and engaged followers who are going to care about you all the time. We've talked about some of this today. But at the same time, leaders who are convinced existentially, philosophically, and practically that leadership is all dark also need a gut check. Leadership isn't all Pache Jeffrey Pfeffer, who we've talked about again today, and I will have him on the podcast eventually. I want to talk with him about leadership BS. But Pache, his point, it isn't all vicious survival in a jungle full of threats. Leaders need to understand and leverage both the light and the dark to pull the culture of themselves, their teams, and their organizations out of the chaos in which many find themselves trapped. Leaders, whether they know it or not, are tasked with doing this thing, and quite frankly, I think now more than ever doing it better. But what happens when the dark gets twisted around? Or what happens when the dark gets to be too dark? What happens when the dark forgets its way back to the light? Modern rationality and science are starting to pull apart the intersections between narcissism, corporate psychopathy, and Machiavellianism in order to develop new theories to explain old constructs. Matter of fact, I would assert ancient constructs.
So would Aristotle.
There you go. This pursuit of a new species of understanding is worthwhile, practicable, and actually applicable to your regular lived life as a leader. This new understanding of old human behavior will lead to hopefully new constructs of leadership that can be revivified generation after generation in what Clark Kent, journalist for the Daily Planet, would call, quote unquote, the never-ending battle against the forces of evil, the principalities and powers, and the rulers of the darkness who prefer to stay in the dark, right, of this world. And as the dark gets more devious, and leaders are going to have to watch out for this, as the dark gets more devious, seeking to hide next to the light, because the light always has a shadow, particularly when it's cast on something, leadership culture will need constant revivification. It'll need constant renewal. Leaders are increasingly being pressured to make decisions about who they're going to be and how they're going to lead, how they're going to be a hero, how they're going to build a myth out of the yawning leadership vacuums that we are experiencing in the 21st century. Fundamentally, I believe, even after I said all that staying on the path, the only path, is the one that cuts both through the light and the dark and cuts through the center of every individual leader's heart. So that's all I've got. Erika, do you have anything you'd like to promote today? Any places you would like the podcast listeners to go?
I will say that everyone listening is welcome to visit www.ascendry.com, which is my website. I talk a lot about the need to understand self before we can engage in any kind of relationship, including a leadership relationship with followers. We talk a lot about the light and the dark and how they exist together. And I talk a lot about how systems sometimes support things that people don't. You know, we talked a little bit today about the system working exactly as it was designed to. And, you know, when you see toxic workplaces, or you see toxic leaders, or you see corporate malfeasance or counterproductive work behaviors, sometimes there are systems in there that are actively upholding those behaviors. And so I think for leaders, the most important thing to remember is that you naturally, as a human being, have both a light side and a shadow, as Jung would call it. The goal, though, is what we call full integration. And full integration is learning to love the parts of yourself that you were taught to hate. In fully integrating, in learning to love the things about yourself that you are uncomfortable with or dislike or even hate, we find that there is an acceptance that allows you to be comfortable enough to open yourself up to other people, to other points of view, to new information. You might call it neuroplasticity, but the goal is for you as a leader to be as available to new information as you possibly can be. And so I would say that for those listening who have questions about how to be the best leader they can possibly be, come to Ascendry, come to www.ascendry.com, read what is going on in the world of academics and practical leadership theory, and see what you can do to make yourself better, to make yourself more actualized, to support yourself, because that's the easiest way to make sure that you don't find yourself in a toxic situation as a leader and a follower.
Awesome. Thank you, Erika. And we will have links to ascendry.com and to books that Erika has mentioned on the podcast today. We will also have links to Erika's LinkedIn profile where you can connect with her and check her out and get connected with her in all the ways that matter. Well, that's it. I'm out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.